So each year, I try to do a service on UUCP's history, and I realized it's been like a pandemic. It's been like 6 years of pandemic, right? And I realized, oh my gosh, I haven't done the history service. I've got to do the history service. And some of you might know that I just went away for 5 days of study leave and read 13 books. That's how hungry I was to read. But several of the books that I read on that time, the themes of communism and the founded or unfounded fear of communists kept coming up. So I knew what I needed to talk about. And because I really actually love that this theme is a part of our history. Like so many places, we don't have an uncomplicated history. We don't have the, oh, we decided to do this and it just happened and it was easy. That's not how it worked at UUCP at all. So let's have a little history refresher. Isabel Johnson, yes, the Johnson Room of right over there, put an ad for a Unitarian church calling it a fellowship of free minds and the creative spirit in 1947. They were meeting at the Kenilworth School on Fifth Avenue between Moreland and Culver. 2 years later, in 1949, the school board asked the congregation to leave because of rumors that there were communists in the group. So they moved to the Valley Garden Center in Encanto Park. 16 months later, permission to use the premises was abruptly withdrawn because there were rumors that there were communists. So they went to the YWCA. The worship was in a big auditorium and the kids were in the unfinished basements. They lasted 3 months. They were asked to leave because rumors that they were communists. Knowing that this was going to continue, this was 3 different places they'd been kicked out of in just a few years. They leased land from a member in 1951 and then eventually bought this land and built this building in 1961. Some have noticed that the entrance is in the back of this building, and some have noticed that it blends in. It almost looks like a really cool bunker. You kind of wonder if the history of this congregation was impacted on how the building was designed. 14 years, 5 moves. That's more than the Palombos have moved, by the way. Close, maybe, okay, well maybe you could run with that. All due to rumors that Unitarians, because that's what they were at the time, were communists. The situation was inflamed when UUCP's second minister, Rev John Finley, signed a letter to President Truman protesting U.S. intervention in Korea. Some of the other signers were self-avowed communists, and once Finley's action became broadly known among his home congregation, the tiny church became embroiled in McCarthyism. Several members resigned their memberships because the scrutiny was so intense. Even worse, at least one member lost his job by virtue of just his membership in this purported Communist Front organization. In April, I had the honor of doing the memorial service for Jesse Hayes. Part of the story of Jesse is that he looked in his file as a school teacher, a public school teacher, and there was a note in his file speculating that he was a communist. Possibly because he was a member here, possibly not. But it's not like it was very back then. That was Jesse. The national movement of aggressively targeting people, usually of the political left, and subjecting them to investigations before government and private panels was rampant during the time. Suspicions were often given credence despite inconclusive and even questionable evidence, and the level of threat posed by a person's real or supposed leftist associations or beliefs were mostly exaggerated. Many people lost their jobs or destruction of their careers. Some were imprisoned. This is the late 1950s and early 1960s. And here in Phoenix, the Republican Party was gaining increasing power in the city and the state thanks to migration and national policy changes. So too was the John Birch Society, which amplified the voice of fearing liberals to be communists. They were a small but vocal force in Phoenix. In the 1961 election for the Phoenix City Council, led by a conservative minister, Reverend Aubrey Moore, they called themselves the Stay American Committee. Does this sound familiar to anyone? A little bit more than coincidence? Are you feeling it? They complained, this Stay American Committee complained that the current city council were stooges of a one-world government conspiracy, if not outright communists. Okay, John LaBarbera, I just saw you. He just went on Zoom. It was awesome. That was great. One of the books I read was A Brief History of Phoenix by John Talton. And Talton says the Stay American Committee saw public improvements as a threat to freedom. The National Municipal League was a stalking horse for totalitarianism. School children collecting funds for UNICEF was a sign of the United Nations designs on Phoenix. Zoning was the first step towards Bolshevism. So you can imagine what they thought about the mostly atheist and humanist Unitarians. So here ends that part of the history lesson. And I'm going to take some really big historical leaps between this part of our UUCP origin story and our current situation. Because, let's admit it, those who were investigating our liberal forebears were not doing a well-rounded investigation of the words of Karl Marx. And I am not saying in here that Marxism or communism is the answer to today's problems. But I am saying that liberal thinkers have always and continue to be on the forefront of looking at the inequities of income, labor, and poverty as a religious and a social issue. In the last 50 years, Unitarian Universalism and much of liberal religion has embraced what is called liberation theology. Liberation theology believes that if we are to be considered a moral and ethical society, a major part of our religion must be focused on the liberation of those in the margins. Liberation theology started in Latin America, working for the freedom of farm workers and the working poor, but it expanded to immigration issues, race issues, homophobia, and transphobia. I quote Miguel de la Torre, who has written several books on liberation theology, with some modifications in language to fit our UU theology. A major critique of liberation theology has been its supposed link with Marxism. Commitment to liberation does not necessarily mean a commitment to some political revolutionary ideology. Rather, it first and foremost refers to the place where God, or love, is encountered. Liberation is a prayerful and spiritual movement that leads us beyond corporations. It is also true that a few liberation theologians have considered themselves to be Marxist, although they have consistently argued that their commitment has always been for liberation, not Marx. End quote. For Christian liberation theologians, including Leonard Boff, what social analysts called structural poverty, they called it structural sin. And what social analysts call the private accumulation of wealth, they called the sin of selfishness. Suffering exists because of this communal sin, which creates poverty, enslavement, and forces humanity to act against their best interests. It is part of the social structure rather than individual acts. In modern times, we've seen attacks on liberation theology and the efforts to address the issues of poverty and marginalization in our world. Famously, in 2010, Fox News commentator Glenn Beck attacked President Barack Obama, saying, "I didn't understand really Obama's theology. I think that is much more of a theological question, that he is a guy who understands the world through liberation theology, which is oppressor and victim." Also sound familiar? Still happening. Beck described liberation theology as a direct opposite of what the gospel is talking about, and Marxism disguised as religion. Beck went even further and said, if your priests, pastors, or ministers use the phrase social justice or economic justice on your church website, run as fast as you can. They are code words. You all ran right here, didn't you? I didn't think you'd run yet. Excellent. Maybe we're all in the right place. The truth is as religious liberals, we cannot separate our religious foundation with the plight of the world. Were our UUCP forebears communists? Possibly some of them were. Who knows? All of them? Definitely not. Were they religious liberals concerned with the well-being of the world? Definitely. And again, I am not arguing for or against communism or Marxism. That's not the point. But I can tell you that there are issues with the current state of capitalism. The top 1% now own around half of the world's wealth. The world's 3.5 billion poorest adults, comprising 70% of the world's working age population, own 2.7% of global wealth. 70% owns 2.7, 1% owns half. I mean, it's really hard to argue with that, right? Most of these poor adults in that 70% live in non-white countries that have been subjected to centuries of slave trading and colonizing and resource dispossessing, which created the modern wealth of the West. Capitalism was not supposed to work like this. I happen to be fond of Senator Elizabeth Warren's different ideas on capitalism. She says, I believe in markets and the benefits they can produce when they work. I love the competition that comes with a market that has decent rules. The problem is when these rules are not enforced, when the markets are not level playing fields, all that wealth is scraped in one direction, leading to deception and theft. Theft is not capitalism. She continues to propose a series of regulations and reforms that her conservative opponents classed as anti-capitalist. Another book I read was from Ibram X. Kendi, and it was the How to Be an Antiracist. And each chapter is about how race and a different element intersect. And he had an excellent one about how race and class intersect. To me, he defines why religious liberals who are fighting for the poor should think about how to modernize capitalism so it works for folks beyond the 1%. Kendi says, I keep using the term anti-capitalist as opposed to socialist or communist to include the people who publicly or privately question or loathe capitalism, but do not identify as socialist or communist. I use anti-capitalist because conservative defenders of capitalism regularly say their liberal and socialist opponents are against capitalism. They say efforts to provide a safety net for all people are anti-capitalist. They say attempts to prevent monopolies are anti-capitalist. They say efforts to strengthen weak unions and weaken exploitative owners are anti-capitalist. They say that plans that normalize worker ownership and regulations, protecting consumers, workers, and environments from big business are anti-capitalist. They say laws taxing the richest more than the middle class, redistributing pilfered wealth, and guaranteeing basic incomes are anti-capitalist. They say wars to end poverty are anti-capitalist. And they say campaigns to remove the profit motive from essential life sectors like education, healthcare, utilities, mass media, and incarceration are anti-capitalist. In doing so, these conservative defenders are defining capitalism. They define capitalism as the freedom to exploit people into economic ruin, the freedom to assassinate unions, the freedom to prey on unprotected consumers, workers, and environments, the freedom to value quarterly profits over climate change, the freedom to undermine small businesses and cushion corporations, the freedom from competition, the freedom not to pay taxes, the freedom to heave that tax burden onto the middle and lower classes, the freedom to commodify everything and everyone, the freedom to keep poor people poor and middle income struggling people to stay middle income, and to make rich people richer. The history of capitalism bears out the conservative definition of capitalism. That ends Kendi's quote. My theology, my beliefs, my Unitarian Universalism implores me, demands of me to stand for the liberation of the poor and the marginalized, to call out injustice wherever it shows up, like in our economic systems. So call me a communist, call me a Marxist, cast my lot with the Phoenix Unitarians of the 1950s and 60s. We're not going to get kicked out of any building anymore for saying that. You know why? Because we own it. That's capitalism. And we did that because in honor of those folks that worked so hard. But I will fight for the capitalism that is being defined by a small margin. I will fight for economic freedom. I will fight for people to believe whatever they want to believe, as long as it is grounded in our values and our humanity. Like our ancestors at UUCP, we will fight to be together, to stay focused on the liberation of all. And even if anyone is communist, Marxist, it doesn't matter. We will persist. We will persist in our values. We will persist in our equity issues, and we will persist in making the world a better place. So might it be so.